When I was a kid, a compliment that I got over and over again, I'd like to point out that I'm using the term compliment very loosely here, was, "Your English is so good. You don't even use slang like those other Spanish kids. You're like so well spoken. Were you born here? Do you have papers?" And while I knew even then that this was sort of a backhanded compliment, I really internalized it. And for a long time, I let that inform my views on teaching and what kind of teacher I would be. I thought that if I could teach my students to master standard American English, that would be their way of showing that they were smart and capable and that they had things to say that were worthy of listening to. I thought they had to beat English at its own game, so to speak. I've learned a lot since the first time I wrote my philosophy of teaching statement, so I'd like to take this chance to go back, revisit some of my old goals, and look at them in a new way. What happened to me is by no means an isolated incident. Dr. April Baker Bell has found in her own work that the same thing happens to Black students when they code switch from Black English to Standard American English. When Black students use Black English, they're seen as being linguistically inadequate. But when they code switch to Standard American English, they get a lot of the same comments that I did. That they're so well spoken, that they sound so intelligent when they speak. But of course, this shows that students are expected to speak a certain way because of their race, and when they speak in their own language, it's often perceived as being worse. And unfortunately, the way that English curriculums have been designed for years and are still designed enables that. James A. Banks, considered one of the pioneers of multicultural education, laid out 4 steps for achieving what he calls multicultural curriculum reform. And these 4 steps are very in line with what we call now culturally sustaining pedagogy. The approaches that you and I are probably used to are the heroes and holidays approach. So, for example, having a class fiesta on Cinco de Mayo, or watching that weird animated Martin Luther King Jr. movie. Did anybody else have to watch that? That was crazy. Anyways, or the ethnic additive approach, where there's a very clear curriculum already in place and multicultural elements are just sort of thrown into it. So kind of the first one, just more of the time. The first 2 approaches are not enough on their own, but they are stepping stones towards the last 2 approaches, the approaches that resonated the most with what my philosophy of teaching has always been and what I'd really like it to be moving forward. Those approaches are the transformative approach and the decision-making and social action approach. The transformative approach calls for a real rethinking of how curriculums are structured. Gloria Ladson-Billings herself has said that culturally sustaining pedagogy uses culturally relevant pedagogy as a place where the beat drops, which is to say that acknowledging your students' different backgrounds is not enough. Acknowledging that they are bringing it to the table is not enough. The work that needs to be done, and the work that I hope I'll be able to do, is to provide spaces for students to use their voices. I never want my students to feel like they have to check certain parts of their identity at the door. With English being so historically strict about what's right and what's wrong, and with how common it is to police the way that people use the language, I need to provide a space where my students can really know and feel that meshing languages is A, as correct as standard American English, and B, oftentimes necessary to express everything that they really want and need to express. When you're working with students from multicultural backgrounds, it's almost impossible to use just standard American English or even edited American English to capture the entire scope of their knowledge. I, as the teacher, need to also make an effort to familiarize myself with the multiple Englishes that these students are going to be bringing in. It's one thing for me to learn from them, but it's so much more meaningful when they can come in with me already understanding some of their language. It builds trust that we're really in a space where they can say what they want and need to say. It opens dialogue for myself and them, and for everyone else who shares that code of reference. Banks's final step, which aligns most with what I think I was trying to say in my original philosophy of teaching statement, remains my main goal in my teaching to this day: to foster political efficacy, to create a desire in students to change things that they see as unjust, and above all else, to empower my students. Identifying the ways in which a student's literacy deviates from the standard can be isolating for them, but it can also be a conduit for community building. different literacies are developed and sustained by sharing. So, helping students find other students who share the same identities, who share the same codes of reference, can be a step towards organizing. People are much more likely not only to become aware of injustices that they've been facing, but to fight against them if they know that they have people who understand what they're going through and back them up. It's important to note that none of these steps can really stand on their own. They all come together to create a classroom where multiculturalism is not an afterthought, it's not tacked on at the end, it's not put on top of a curriculum that is already the standard. It is the curriculum. It is what informs the decisions that you make, the lesson plans that you create, the way that students interact with each other, the way that you interact with students. I started out my first philosophy of teaching statement with the cliche, knowledge is power. And I still believe that. But just teaching them English is not going to provide them any sort of power. Giving students opportunities to hone their own voice and to find the ways in which what they have to say, the ways that their lived experience has informed their literacy, their version of English, to find the ways that that can work not only for themselves but for others is what gives them power.